In the previous videos, we've created mutations to add items, remove them, and fetch a cart by ID or create it if it doesn't exist. Let's go ahead and add a new item to the cart, and we'll give this an amount. And if we run this mutation, we'll see here that we have a new cart returned to us with the total items as 1, and we have the subtotal for that cart. If we run this mutation again, we can see here the subtotal has been updated, and so has the total items. What we want to do in this video is create a mutation that we can use to increase the number of items in the cart without having to pass all of this information again to the add item mutation. Inside of schema.graphql, let's go ahead now and declare a new mutation, and we'll call this increase cart item. Then, using the similar format as above, we'll pass input as our argument, and we'll call this input type increase cart item input. We'll then return a cart. Let's take this, and below where we have our input types, let's then declare this input type and what fields and scalar types this has. And similar to where we have our remove from cart, we'll take this and we'll also declare that inside of increase cart item input. Now, let's stop the server, and we'll run npm run codegen, and this will update our types. If we close this and we open types.ts, if we get the name of our input type and we make a search, we can see here that we have successfully regenerated our resolver parent types, and we can see that this has been exported and it has all of the different scalars and fields correctly generated inside of this types.ts file. The next thing that we want to do is actually create the resolver, and you guessed, we will do this inside of the API index file. So similar to where we have remove item, now when we begin to type, we can see that the GraphQL code generator, because it has generated those types, this is now telling me inside of the code editor that increase cart items is now needed. So we can create the resolver for increase cart item. We'll ignore the first argument to our resolver, we'll destructure input from the second, and then we'll fetch Prisma from the GraphQL context. Then, similar to what we did above, we'll call Prisma.cartItem, and this time we'll call .update, and here we can pass it some new data. What we'll actually pass now is quantity, and again, similar to what we did before, we can pass increment. You can also see here that there are different methods on this integer field, and this is a great benefit of using something like Prisma. Because it's an integer field, it's able to provide some further functions that you can use to augment and change what that value is. But in this case, we'll just call increment. And here we'll provide the value of 1. Now we're not done just yet, as you can probably see by the red squiggly lines. We need to actually tell Prisma what it needs to update. And we can do this by passing where, and using the special ID underscore cart ID unique constraint that we defined previously, we can now pass the ID, which will be input.id, and then we can pass cart ID, and we can get that from input.cartID. Then let's go ahead and select cart ID, and we can get this cart ID from the response by destructuring it like this. Then all that's left to do is return the cart, and we can use find or create cart, passing Prisma, and then the cart ID. Now if we restart Next.js and head on over to localhost, if we now refresh, inside of our mutation documentation, we should see here that we have a new mutation called increase cart item. And we can see the input type here takes a ID and cart ID. So let's create a new tab. We'll call mutation, and we'll call increase cart item. And we'll provide the ID of our cart item 1, and we'll pass it the cart ID 1 week GraphQL. And if we update the query that's returned, we can fetch the ID and the subtotal, formatted and raw amount. Then if we fetch the items in our cart, and we get the name and we get the quantity, if we now run this, you'll notice here that the quantity 3 for our first item will increase when I run this mutation. So this is great. This is our GraphQL mutation for increasing items done. And if we go back to Prisma Studio and we have a look at cart item, we can see here that we have quantity 6 inside of our database. If we go back to Yoga and we run this again, this is now returning 7. And if we go back to Prisma and refresh, the quantity in the database has been updated to 7.